Hey everyone, have you ever, just paused and really looked at the world, maybe a mountain or even just a grain of sand, or looked up at the stars and felt this flicker? Like maybe there's something more going on, not just the physical stuff, but some kind of inner life maybe, an awareness tucked inside everything? We usually think consciousness is just, well, ours, something that happens in complicated brains. But what if that's not the whole story? Today we're diving deep into something pretty fascinating, maybe even a bit mind-bending. Panpsychism. It's this idea, and it's gaining some serious ground, that suggests consciousness isn't some weird fluke. Instead, it might be a fundamental, totally widespread feature of the whole universe, like a basic kind of experience is part of all matter, right down to the tiniest bits.
Exactly. And it's not just some, quirky old idea or new age thing, though it has deep roots. Panpsychism is actually seeing a big comeback right now. It's sparking real debate among, well, neuroscientists, physicists, philosophers.
Yeah.
It really challenges how we usually think about mind and matter. It forces us to ask, what is consciousness, really? And where should we even expect to find it?
Right.
So, yeah, we'll explore what it actually means, where it came from, why it's popping up again now, and, importantly, the big arguments for and against it.
Right. So our mission today is to give you a real shortcut to understanding this whole complex thing. We've pulled out the key bits of info from our sources, the main arguments, its surprising history, what it means today, especially for those of you who already follow these kinds of discussions and just want to get to the core of it faster. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's try and unpack this central idea, panpsychism. At its most basic level, it's the philosophical view that mind or consciousness or maybe just experience is, well, intrinsic, an irreducible part of the universe, which is a huge departure from what most people assume, right? The physicalist view.
Yeah,
That consciousness just sort of emerges when matter gets complex enough, like in a brain.
exactly. Physicalism says it pops out of non-conscious stuff.
But panpsychism says no, even the smallest things, particles, atoms, maybe quantum fields, they have some primitive kind of experience already baked in.
And that difference, intrinsic versus emergent, that's absolutely key here. When panpsychists talk about mind-like aspects, they don't mean a quark is, solving equations or feeling happy.
Right. Not like us.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's more about a really basic awareness, a fundamental subjectivity. Think of it like there's a tiny what it's like to be that particle. It's not just its mass and charge and spin from the outside.
Okay. So an inner quality.
An inner quality, exactly.
Yeah.
Consciousness isn't this magical jump from 0 to 1. It's always there, a fundamental property just existing on this huge spectrum of complexity. Incredibly simple in an electron, maybe, and unbelievably complex in us.
Wow. That immediately throws up some pretty tricky questions, doesn't it? Like if a particle has this basic what it's likeness, how is that really different from just reacting, a physical response, like a plant turning to the light? We don't usually say the plant experiences the light in a subjective way. What's the difference here?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And it hits right at how panpsychists are kind of redefining experience. It's not about thinking or feeling complex emotions. It's about pure subjectivity, having an inner point of view, no matter how simple. So the plant reacting, that's usually seen as just mechanism, objective process.
Okay.
But a panpsychist might say a particle doesn't just react to a force in a purely mechanical way. It has a primitive experience of that interaction. It's about these intrinsic qualities, sometimes called protoqualia, that exist inside the system, not just its outward behavior.
So like the difference between a thermostat detecting temperature and you feeling cold.
Precisely.
Yeah.
One is just information processing. The other involves that subjective what it's like.
Fascinating. It really does stretch how you think about experience. Now, it feels very modern, this idea. But you mentioned it has deep roots. It's amazing how long people have been wrestling with this sort of inner life of the cosmos idea. Where did it start?
So it's an ancient intuition, really.
Yeah.
It goes way back. Think about Thales of Miletus, like 6th century BCE, often called the first Western philosopher. He famously said, everything is full of gods. And while, that sounds like polytheism, many folks think he was hinting at something deeper, like a pervasive animacy, a kind of inherent aliveness in nature itself. It wasn't just dead matter.
Interesting. So not just rocks and water, but rocks and water with some kind of living principle inside.
Something like that. And you see this thread picked up again and again. Plato, for instance, talked about a world soul, the anima mundi, that permeates the whole cosmos.
Right.
For him, the universe wasn't just a machine. It was a living thing with its own kind of mind.
A cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the Stoics. hugely influential thinkers. They talked about the logos, this divine rational principle that runs through all of nature. It's the intelligent force organizing everything. So to them, mind wasn't separate from the world. It was the world's organizing principle. It's a really powerful, ancient lineage thinking along these lines.
And these weren't just poetic ideas, were they? They actually laid some serious philosophical groundwork that pops up again much later in surprisingly complex ways. How did thinkers like Leibniz and Spinoza in the, 17th century, how did they run with
Oh,
this?
they were absolutely pivotal. You take Gottfried Leibniz, brilliant mind. He came up with his theory of monads. These weren't like physical atoms. They were indivisible points, centers of perception and, well, appetite was his word.
Centers of perception.
Yeah, each monad was like its own little universe, mirroring the big one. And crucially, each one had an inner life, an experience. They didn't physically bump into each other. Leibniz thought their apparent interactions were a pre-established harmony set up by God. But the key thing is, reality for Leibniz was fundamentally made of these experiential units.
So it flipped the script. Instead of mind somehow emerging from dead matter, for Leibniz, matter itself was kind of composed of mind-like stuff.
Pretty much, yeah. Or at least inherently experiential stuff. And then you have Baruch Spinoza, another 17th century giant. He took a different path, but just as radical. He argued mind and matter weren't two different things like Descartes thought.
The old mind-body split.
Right. Spinoza said they're just two aspects or attributes of one single infinite substance, which he called God or nature. So everything that exists, whether we see it as mental or physical, is just a different expression of this one underlying reality. Mind and matter are inseparable, two sides of the same coin.
Wow, so no mind-body problem for Spinoza because they were never separate to begin with.
Exactly. It's a profound kind of monism.
It's just amazing to see these ancient feelings and these really sophisticated, early modern ideas coming back so strongly today. What does it tell us that serious philosophers and even some scientists are looking at panpsychism again in the 21st century?
That's a great question. I think it shows how persistent these big questions are about consciousness, about reality, and maybe it shows, well, a certain dissatisfaction with purely physical explanations for everything, especially for subjective experience. And speaking of today, one person who's really pushed this back into the spotlight is the philosopher Philip Goff. Around 2019, he popularized this idea of Galileo's error.
Galileo's error, what's that?
Goff argues that back when Galileo and the pioneers of modern science were setting things up, they made a crucial decision. They decided science should only deal with quantities, things you can measure objectively: size, shape, location, motion.
Okay, makes sense for physics.
Yeah, it did. But in doing so, Goff says, they deliberately excluded all the qualities, things like color, sound, taste, and crucially, subjective experience itself, consciousness.
So by making science purely objective, they basically wrote consciousness out of the fundamental description of the physical world.
That's Goff's argument. He says science made matter inert and non-experiential by definition. And in doing that, we basically created the hard problem of consciousness for ourselves later on.
The problem of how you get experience from non-experience.
Exactly. How does that jump happen? Goff thinks panpsychism is the best way to fix Galileo's supposed error. It puts consciousness back into the fundamental nature of matter, filling that gap without needing spooky dualism or saying consciousness just magically appears.
That's a really powerful critique of a basic scientific assumption. But Goff's not alone, right? What about other frameworks, maybe closer to science, like integrated information theory, IIT, Giulio Tononi's idea? That sounds more measurable.
It does aim to be, yes.
Yeah.
IIT is definitely one of the leading scientific theories about consciousness right now. Tononi and his team propose that consciousness is integrated information. Basically, any system that has a high degree of what they call causal irreducibility.
Causal irreducibility, meaning?
Meaning the system as a whole has causal powers that you can't reduce just to the sum of its individual parts acting independently. Its parts are deeply interconnected and affect each other in complex ways.
Okay.
Any system with that property, IIT says, has some degree of consciousness. They call this measure phi. The more integrated and irreducible the system, the higher its phi, the more conscious it is.
So it's not just about complexity, but about how things are fundamentally woven together. Could you give an example? Like, why is a brain high phi, but maybe a computer isn't, even if it's complex?
Sure. A standard computer, even a powerful one, is often seen in IIT terms as quite modular. You can break it down into components, CPU, RAM, storage, and their functions are relatively separate. Its causal power is largely reducible. But your brain, Billions of neurons firing, constantly influencing each other in incredibly complex feedback loops to create one unified experience that's highly irreducible. If you tweak one part, it can ripple through the whole system's processing. So IIT gives a hi-fi to a brain, but maybe a very, very low-fi to simple things like a light switch or even individual neurons, and maybe intermediate phi to other biological systems. It points towards consciousness being graded, potentially widespread.
Which definitely leans towards a panpsychist view, even if it doesn't explicitly say everything is conscious.
Right. It provides a potential physical marker for degrees of consciousness.
What about process philosophy? You mentioned Alfred North Whitehead earlier. How does that fit in?
Whitehead offers a really different way of looking at reality altogether. It's dynamic, event-based. He argued that reality isn't made of static stuff, like enduring particles or objects. Instead, the fundamental building blocks are occasions of experience, or actual occasion.
Occasions of experience, so events, not things.
Exactly. Events are primary. And crucially, each of these fundamental events has a subjective aspect. It's inherently experiential.
So for Whitehead, the very act of being, of existing from moment to moment, is an experience.
Precisely. To be is to be an experience. These occasions sort of feel or prehend past occasions and integrate them into a new subjective moment. Even something like a rock isn't just a static lump. It's a society, a structured pathway of these incredibly simple occasions of experience constantly happening, constantly prehending their environment in a rudimentary way.
Wow. So that completely dissolves the mind-matter problem by just saying reality is experiential at its very foundation.
That's the goal. It makes experience fundamental.
Okay. So we've got these historical roots, these contemporary theories, but obviously, suggesting consciousness is literally everywhere is a huge claim. There must be some powerful arguments both for and against it. This is where the real debate happens, right?
Absolutely. Let's lay out the main arguments for panpsychism first. Why do its proponents find it so compelling? Number one, as we touched on, is that it offers a potential solution to the hard problem of consciousness. That really baffling question, how could purely non-conscious physical stuff ever give rise to subjective feeling, what it's like of experience?
Right. The jump seems impossible to explain.
But if experience is already a fundamental property of matter, even in a simple form, then the problem changes.
Yeah.
It's not how does consciousness arise from nothing, but how do simple experiences combine to form complex ones?
Still a hard problem, maybe, but a different one.
A different one, perhaps a more tractable one. Secondly, it avoids the emergence mystery. Critics of standard physicalism often talk about the magic of emergence. How does consciousness just poof into existence when brains get complicated enough? It seems like a radical discontinuity.
Yeah, where's the line?
Panpsychism avoids that by saying there is no magic jump. Consciousness doesn't emerge from non-consciousness. It's always there. It just gets organized, integrated, becomes more complex. It's a continuum. And thirdly, there's the argument for continuity with nature. Panpsychism puts consciousness squarely within the natural world, not as some weird exception that only happens in brains.
So mind becomes part of the universe's basic furniture, not a strange outlier.
Exactly. It makes consciousness seem less like an anomaly and more like a fundamental aspect of reality alongside things like mass and charge.
Those are definitely strong points, addressing some really deep puzzles, but I can already hear the skeptics. Wouldn't they just say, okay, you say experience is fundamental, but you haven't explained how it's fundamental, you've just asserted it. Isn't that just pushing the mystery down a level?
That's a very fair and common challenge. Proponents would respond by saying, well, yes, we don't fully understand how fundamental consciousness combines or relates to physical properties yet. But, they'd argue, it does solve the origin problem, the hard problem, by giving consciousness a basic place in reality's inventory from the start. It shifts the focus from the seemingly impossible jump, non-conscious to conscious, to the combination problem, simple conscious to complex conscious. And they believe that problem, while still incredibly hard, is at least conceptually possible to tackle within a scientific framework, unlike the original hard problem. It gives us a starting point.
Okay, that makes sense as a response. But yeah, let's get into those criticisms because they are serious. What are the biggest arguments against panpsychism?
Right. The arguments against it are significant. Probably the most famous and toughest one is the combination problem. We just touched on it. If every particle, every field excitation has its own tiny speck of consciousness, how on earth do these zillions of micro-experiences combine to create your single, unified, complex consciousness right now?
Yeah, how do tiny sparks become one big fire? It's not intuitive.
It's really not. The philosopher William James made this point powerfully. He basically said, you can't just add up 1,000 separate feelings and get one big feeling. You just get 1,000 separate feelings.
So it's not just about adding up information, it's about creating a unified subjective experience.
Precisely. How do you get the combination of subjects, not just the combination of contents? My consciousness feels like a single I. If my brain is made of countless tiny conscious bits, where does the I come from? Does a table made of conscious particles have its own unified table consciousness? Most panpsychists would say no, but explaining why consciousness combines in brains but not tables is a massive challenge.
That does sound like a major hurdle. What else?
Another big one is testability, or falsifiability. This is a huge issue for the scientific-minded. Critics argue that panpsychism, especially in its strong forms, is basically impossible to test experimentally. How could you ever design an experiment to prove or disprove that an electron has a tiny bit of experience?
Right. You can't ask it.
You can't ask it. You can't measure its subjective state directly. So if you can't test it, is it really a scientific hypothesis? Or is it more like metaphysics, a philosophical stance?
Which isn't necessarily wrong, but it's different from science.
It's different. And for many, that lack of empirical traction is a deal breaker. And finally, there's the argument about redundancy. Many neuroscientists and philosophers working on physicalist or functionalist theories believe they are making progress in explaining consciousness purely in terms of brain activity, neural networks, computation, and evolution.
They think they can get there without needing consciousness to be fundamental everywhere else.
Exactly. They argue that if we can eventually explain consciousness based on complex physical systems like brains, then adding this extra layer of universal fundamental consciousness is, well, unnecessary. It's an extra entity, maybe an unparsimonious one, that doesn't actually add explanatory power where we need it most, understanding human and animal minds. Why make things more complicated than they need to be?
Okay, so bringing this all together, what's the takeaway for us trying to get our heads around this? To recap, panpsychism is basically saying consciousness isn't this rare thing that pops up only in brains. It's fundamental. It's everywhere, from quarks to quasars, just in vastly different forms and complexities. It's an idea that really pushes against our usual assumptions about, well, about everything.
It absolutely does.
Yep.
Panpsychism offers this radically different lens for looking at the universe and, our own place in it. It makes you question the very definition of mind. Where do we draw the line between living and non-living, conscious and unconscious? Maybe those lines aren't as sharp as we think. It's definitely not just some abstract philosophical game. It's a perspective shift that can make you see existence itself differently.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If everything, down to the smallest atom, really does have some tiny spark of inner life, some primitive experience, what does that actually imply? Does it change how you feel about your connection to the rest of the universe? Does it make the world seem more alive, maybe less lonely? Or does it just make it all seem even more profoundly weird and mysterious?
It really does challenge us to stretch our imagination, doesn't it? Think about it. What would it truly mean if the basic stuff of reality wasn't just inert matter, but held some tiny glimmer of subjectivity? What new questions does that raise for you? About life, about matter, about the whole cosmos. It suggests reality might have this hidden inner dimension we're only just starting to even consider. It definitely gives you something to ponder.